In the spring of 2015, direct-to-consumer DNA testing arrived in American life with the same casual, consumerist air as a new kitchen gadget. Inexpensive, curious, treated like a diversion. The kits sat on shelves as novelties. Advertising promised tidy revelations in percentages and color-coded charts. They were durable party props, an invitation to gossip rather than a summons to reckon. On a Sunday in late June 2015, under the maple trees that shaded my parents' backyard, someone produced a box of those kits. We scraped cotton-tipped swabs against our cheeks, scanned barcodes, posted staged photos, and folded the whole thing into the weekend's pleasures. 3 weeks after those results had been circulated among us, the joke stopped being a joke. In July 2015 an email arrived, blunt, precise, from a man none of us had met who called himself Marco. "My father is your father, and I would like to talk." That single sentence was an intrusion that refused to be ignored. It set in motion everything that followed: the late-night conversations at the kitchen table, the recipes quietly exchanged, the petition folded into a mailbox months later. It was the hinge on which our lives turned. What happened next did not look like a single dramatic collapse or catharsis. It was instead a sequence of small, sharp moments that rearranged the furniture of our lives. We learned how slowly a household can accommodate an uninvited truth. Dinners became rehearsals. Familiar banter grew brittle with unsaid things. Some evenings the conversation felt paused, as if someone's hand rested on the remote. We offered safe parentheses, whether the price of eggs, while the wound sat obvious at the table. Memory, once regarded as settled, began to fissure under examination. We reread decades the way one reads a letter from an old acquaintance, checking dates and details for motive and meaning, searching for a paragraph that might exonerate or condemn. My mother, taciturn and private, absorbed this arrival in the kitchen's quiet register. She began trading recipes and photographs with Marco the way smugglers trade contraband. Small, furtive, and governed by a ritual of secrecy. A photocopy of a faded casserole recipe, my father's perennial failure, appeared on the countertop. In return, Marco emailed a photograph of a son I had never known, grinning too close to the lens. They treated these exchanges like secret handshakes. My brother, protective and cautious, kept an even more measured distance, guarding the contours of the life he had always inhabited. Even he softened in small increments, a recommendation for a mechanic, the passing of a name for a job. These were not declarations of welcome so much as pragmatic acknowledgments that a man with responsibilities needs parts and friends and help carrying plywood in bad weather. James, my brother by blood who had once delivered moral clarity like thunder, surprised us all. He moved away from theatrical judgment towards steady, unglamorous constancy. He offered Marco odd jobs, sanding a deck, tuning a carburetor, heaving heavy things when rain made them heavier. He did bodywork on Marco's car and, more consequentially, kept showing up. That quiet repetition redefined what belonging could look like. James performed no loyalty for an audience. He lived it by hauling wood and lending tools. Small, ordinary acts that threaded a new continuity through our household. The most painful moments were not public confrontations but the rekindling of old stories. Secrets, once pried open, refract everything else. Old hurts resurfaced in new forms. My niece, 12 at the time, cut through adult equivocation one evening across the dinner table. If there are so many sons, how do we know which one to love? Children measure the world in simple arithmetic, and her question reduced a complicated history to an accusation: how to allocate the scarce commodity of belonging. We told her what adults often say and struggle to embody: love is not divisible into neat slices. Families improvise. They sew affection on by hand with visible stitches. Saying that felt like issuing a prognosis, practical but humiliating, admitting that our places had to be negotiated. Public attention arrived as predictably as weather, loud and then gone. Outrage descends like a gull, noisy, insistent, and quickly diverted by the next spectacle. A cousin who thrived on being first at every fundraiser drooled over the scandal for a moment, then drifted away when a fresher story caught the editor's eye. The local paper ran fewer pieces as time passed. A neighbor who had once cornered me on a rain-slick morning, asking whether digging into our father's life had been worth it, later bumped into me in the grocery aisle and inquired, less sharply, how Marco was settling. I answered in the measured cadence of someone reporting a diagnosis. Yes, because we had to know. Knowing, despite its costs, was preferable to living under an elegant falsehood. There were small, redeeming domestic scenes amid the pain. Marco taught my children to cast a fishing line the way my father had taught me, an unhurried swing that sent the bait across the water. Watching them, the gesture looked older than any of us. It was muscle memory reactivated by a stranger who turned out to be kin. My mother, who had initially refused to leave a chair empty for the newcomer, began to set an extra plate when she heard Marco's children might visit. She never announced it. She slid a spare plate and a fork into the table's periphery, and when sticky-handed children arrived she quietly folded that plate into play. Marco's children absorbed our family's architecture in footprints and footnotes, jokes, grudges, rituals. They inherited, as children do, the complicated legacy our father had left, an understanding that love can be stitched in imperfect ways. Observing them on the living room rug over toy trucks my father had once favored, it became clear that life arranges itself irrespective of moral pronouncements. People arrive where they arrive. The work falls to the living to accommodate rather than erase. This mundane work of making room resisted cinematic treatment. Forgiveness did not arrive in a sunset speech, it arrived in the repetition of small decencies. James learned the names of Marco's children not in a single reveal, but by saying them aloud while handing Henry a sandwich or buckling Sophia into a car seat. He crossed the threshold for Thanksgiving once, then again. With each visit his glance softened by fractions. My mother planted another seed on her windowsill and began babysitting for Marco's children once a month. The intimacy that grew was not solemn or ceremonial but domestic. Humming over breakfast, smoothing a smear of lipstick from a sticky mouth. There were reversals that cut deep. Marco's arrival reopened the cruel arithmetic our father had practiced, tallying offenses as if they were currency. Lineage flattens individuality into repeat patterns and punishes the repeat for the progenitor's crimes. Neighbors and cousins eager for a tidy moral tale tried to recast our private mess into a public fable. We fought to resist that pull. Messy, loud fights focused on recognizing each person as a whole rather than a footnote of inheritance. Sometimes we failed. Sometimes we did not. On a winter night marked by the first real frost of 2017, my mother sat by the window looking at a collage of photographs that now held more faces than it once had. Pointing to one, she said simply, "This is the life we have." She did not call it good or bad, she named it. There was an honesty in that plain statement. Less relief than acceptance, a sober faith. It resembled a truce between resignation and the willingness to keep trying. If there is a lesson here, it is earned rather than preached. Secrets demand acknowledgement. Once aired, the world rarely rearranges itself into moral neatness. People respond with contradiction, petty cruelties and astonishing kindness, silence and generosity. We gained relatives and lost the illusion that the past could be flattened into a photograph. Lineage offered choices, not certainties. It opened some doors and slammed others. For Marco, insertion into our family was uneven and slow. He knit himself to us like a new stitch, visible at close range, sometimes awkward, sometimes perfect. He did not repair our father's wrongs in sweeping gestures, he did not absolve the past. What he brought was insistence on presence, a claim to recognition that made it harder for us to remain small in our resentments. My brother, who at first wanted the whole discovery to be a nightmare he could wake from, found a muted peace in the ordinary rhythms that grated less than he had feared. It was compromise, not triumph. Life, as it does, went on. New scandals distracted the town. The Polaroids and social media indictments faded. The photograph on our mantel came to include Marco and his children. He was rarely front and center. The center still carried the weight of those long known, but he was present in our domestic archive, weather-streaked and necessary, like someone who arrives after a storm. It is important to return to the origins. The DNA kits, bought for fun by some, by others with half a curiosity, did what curiosity always does when it finds a loose thread, it tugged and the garment unstitched. We had taken cheek swabs at a picnic table in June 2015, laughing, scanning barcodes like we were shipping parcels. We forgot the samples until the report slipped under the door. Percentages, matches, an unordered truth. 3 weeks after circulation came Marco's email in July 2015. 3 weeks after his message, we sat late into an August 2015 kitchen night, speaking as if that night might be the last before a storm. That August night was not a trial, but an act of listening. We told stories, timid, generous, defensive, because memory is not identical to fact yet can still hold truth. We allowed that a single man could be villain in one life and tender in another. That nuance prevented the flattening of our father into a single caricature. We agreed. Knowing mattered because it created options we had lacked. The bruise of revelation never fully faded. It became a color in our speech, a tint we wore into new conversations. We learned the human capacity for contradiction, unkindness and tenderness in the same sentence. In that uneasy space we made room for another son. Not because his presence rewrote the past, but because it altered our possible futures. That admission was a moral experiment. Could we expand without dissolving into resentment? A fragile calm followed. For a while we imagined ordinary barbecues and birthday cakes without the expectation of social media spectacle. Then bureaucracy arrived in the form of a petition. Early in 2016, a polite, sharp insertion of legal form was folded into our mailbox, a request to acknowledge paternity. At first Marco wanted recognition more than money, a name on a headstone, a place in the family Bible, a formal claim to memory. But there are people who hear nothing and smell opportunity. Lawyers whose vocabulary is contingency and neighbors who thrill at someone's private grief made public. The petition, administrative at first, spread like a stone dropped in water. A cousin who loved being first took it to the local paper with relish. The headline framed scandal and the comments read like public verdicts. My brother wanted to fight. He saw the petition as an invasion, leverage to pry open fresh wounds. James's silence at the first family meeting felt like an earthquake. My mother was reduced to helplessness, revealing how deep the old rules still rent. Marco sat at our kitchen table like a man whose hands had been taken, and when he spoke in detail he told us what being found had cost him. He described a childhood lived at our father's fringes. Holidays whispered near but never in, gifts that came sporadically, apologies that never shaped themselves into admission. He admitted shame, the humiliation of being the secret that, once discovered, would shock a town that favored tidy lineages. He was embarrassed, small, angry that his existence could be weaponized against a family he had only just met. Demands for inventories followed. Checks never cashed, calls missed, slurs remembered. Some treated the petition as provocation. Others claimed it an attempt to enlarge our father into a greater villain for courtroom convenience. Marco's lawyer spoke soberly. My brother's counsel sharpened outrage into tactic. Legal language has a way of masquerading as moral reasoning. Our kitchen became a place of cold calculus where compassion risked being traded for advantage. In the courtroom of public opinion, nuance evaporates, accusations and counters rush in. Old resentments hardened into positions. Alliances formed along unlikely lines. My niece, still young, still measuring affection, asked with brittle terror, if he gets anything, does that mean Dad stopped being ours? The question revealed a primal fear, identity. It was not money they feared losing, but custody of the family story. Recognition felt like dilution to some, as if the family narrative were a chalice that inclusion might pollute. Then something unpredicted shifted the tone. James, who avoided theatrics, gathered everyone and read a creased letter he had kept tucked in his Bible. The letter was not a legal confession. It was awkward and apologetic, admitting to absence and naming regret rather than promising restitution. There was no accounting of money, no tidy promises. The voice in the paper accepted failure and conveyed a human flaw. James did not cast himself as judge. He asked us to choose otherwise than our father had. It was not a cure. The petition continued to circulate and gossip kept churning. But the mood changed. Conversation tilted from accusation to decision. Marco, exhausted by spectacle, softened his stance and made a private, startling offer. He would accept acknowledgement without contesting the will for material gain. He asked only for what had been denied most of his life: recognition, a name on the headstone, a listing in the family Bible and non-legal archives. The request was modest materially and enormous symbolically. That offer was less a miracle than a truce. Resentment lingered. Quiet calculations about fairness and legacy continued. My mother wept at the sink as if hot water and steam could unstick something deeper. The suds and steam were a private ritual of unmaking. Marco's modest ask, naming on a headstone, inclusion in family records, felt at once small and vast. We continued to argue at times and said ugly things when tired. But the most dangerous threats receded. Marco started stopping by the hardware store like anyone else. James stopped sending resentful whispers and began leaving a toolbox on Marco's porch with a note, "Fix the trailer, keep the receipt." There is nothing romantic in such acts. They are precisely the kind of healing this family learned to do, day-to-day work of living side by side. Small reversals mattered. In spring 2017, James attended one of Marco's children's school plays. He watched with a face that did not liquefy into warmth but softened like wax. Afterwards he offered, awkwardly, to take the youngest out for ice cream. These gestures were not scenes from redemption films. They were modest accommodations that quietly disarmed a story bent on singular meanings. The town continued to gossip. The cousin who had published the petition remained eager at the edges, hurling small stabs of outrage over coffee and social media. People prefer narratives with heroes and villains. We refused to fit. When a follow-up article tried to frame our private argument as a morality play, the quotes simplified everything. In our living room the conversation had shifted. We spoke less of blame and more about how to carry truth together. Lawyers' jargon lurked in the periphery, but most of us tried to behave like neighbors rather than prosecutors. Eventually, we made a visible choice. We placed a photograph on the mantel, an ordinary domestic act that suddenly felt heavy with agreement. The camera had been set on a summer afternoon. The porch light softened the faces. My mother stood at the center holding a toddler. James had his arm around Marco, and Marco's children, sunburned and oblivious to adult architectures of reconciliation, clung to the stoop. The picture's arrival was late and shaming. Too much harm had come before it could exist. Standing before it, I felt the layers that made it necessary. The weeks of furious negotiation, the petty comments, the small kindnesses like James lending a ladder. We kept the photograph not as proof that everything had been forgiven, but as evidence that we had painfully and imperfectly decided to live together. The legal side cooled. By 2018, we had settled on terms acknowledging Marco without rearranging material inheritances. He received recognition. His name on our father's headstone, a listing in the family Bible and in our non-legal archives. There was no courtroom spectacle, no public divestment of private drawers. That absence of litigation was both practical and moral. We had seen, in the letter James read, that our father's failures left sorrow more plentiful than resources. None of us wanted to turn private grief into a spectator sport. Scars remained. A select few in town continued their quiet hostility. A few neighbors offered thin praise. The cousin who had loved being first grew less visible at holiday events. The neighbor who once asked whether the digging had been worth it later asked, with soft curiosity, whether things had settled. I replied honestly, not perfectly but with new rules. We chose knowledge over ignorance, peace over vengeance. If resolution is measured by the absence of friction, we did not resolve everything. But if it is measured by the size of the table, we did expand it. We made room for another son, not to repair a broken past but as an experiment in what we might be now. Grief, memory, and parenting are stubbornly untidy. We learned to inhabit their contradictions. We learned about the town. Reputation is quick and cruel, narrative is currency, public curiosity feels like a scalpel. Our dignity lived in small choices, in how we spoke of one another in private and in refusing to make family a contest. There were humiliations. Marco endured comments aimed at our father. He bore accusations simply for existing. Some equated blood with blame in ways that were ugly to witness. Yet humiliation did not calcify into hatred. Marco's humility, his repeated insistence that he did not want money but a place in our stories, worked like a steady pressure reshaping hardened attitudes. It became progressively harder, practically and morally, to keep saying no. There were betrayals as well. Those who claimed loyalty sometimes used the petition to settle unrelated scores. Local commentators turned private pain into theater and amplified petty cruelties. Social media multiplied the harm, private grief broadcast for strangers' judgment. That multiplication was perhaps the worst part. There were also beautiful reversals no comment section predicted. James continued to show up. He once taped a repair bill to Marco's door with a scrawled note, "Pay me back when you can." He performed inconvenient brotherly labor and so became dependable. He answered texts, attended more events, oscillating between old barbs and new care. Those micro-movements mattered more than any pronouncement. Privately we rehearsed the same conclusion: knowing had been worth it because it gave us choices. We could have preserved a tidy myth, pretending the ledger balanced, but a tidy myth is a lie. The DNA kits dragged us into daylight none of us had asked for. The cost was immediate: shame, public spatter, strangers' cruelty. The benefit was quieter and long-term: the ability to relate without the anesthetic of ignorance. We traded a comfortable illusion for the messy possibility of honesty. Looking back from 2020, that felt like moral maturing, uneven and incomplete but real. Years later, at an autumn funeral in 2021, I watched my mother move through a crowd remembering earlier versions of our family. A woman who had once critiqued our choices approached and said simply, "I'm glad you all handled it." My mother answered without heroism, "We handled it the only way we could." There is truth in that sentence, an admission of limitation and a refusal of self-congratulation. It suggested a new ethic for us, not righteous purity, but the courage of ordinary choices. When I pass the mantle and look at that photograph, I think about what is owed and to whom. I think of the letter James kept in his Bible, a clumsy apology that altered how we spoke. I think of the petition that threatened to cleave us and of Marco folding his ask back into something manageable. I think of my niece at 12 asking for an arithmetic of love and of our reply, "Love is not evenly divisible. Belonging is not a ledger of inherited sin but a set of small, repeated gestures." It is at the sink, on porches, in hardware stores, and in the unglamorous rituals of showing up where the real labor happened. We sought knowledge and found it. Knowledge, like every gift, arrived wrapped in cost. We paid with privacy and a neatness of story. In return we received, slowly and often unglamorously, the chance to extend ourselves into a larger, more complicated truth. The payoff was not a headline or a legal verdict but a life rearranged to make room. The portrait on our mantle is proof of that rearrangement: imperfect, late hours. When the ledger was finally spread, we decided not to let the sums alone dictate the verdict. We left a place for one more son, not to repair the past but as an experiment in how to be next. The photograph on the mantle became a kind of stubborn ledger. In the summer of 2018, after the settlement that left material inheritances largely undisturbed but placed Marco's name on the headstone and into the family Bible, we gathered at the cemetery on a clear, dry morning to affix the stonework. It was June 23, 2018. Someone kept the date in a note, and we chose it for its routine ordinariness, as if an ordinary day could make silences ordinary. A small circle of relatives and friends stood in the sunlight while a stonemason chiseled in the letters. Marco stood at the edge with his hands in his pockets and his voice thin. My mother held a thermos and a paper cup, doing what she always does: supply warm liquids and steady hands. James handed Marco a pair of gloves as if handing over a symbol. There were a few cameras. A reporter from the paper snaffled a photograph for a sidebar. The town hummed with readiness to regress into spectacle, but for once the story did not combust. People watched, looked away, offered condolences, and some offered small notes of forgiveness. That day we placed a name onto stone not to sanctify the past but to refuse its erasure. The work of living after knowledge began to feel like maintenance rather than drama. In 2019 Marco repaired a screen door at my uncle's house. James taught one of Marco's daughters to change a tire. My mother began to staple more pages into the family Bible, a small, honest chronicle of births, illnesses, and the grudging amends that stitch through our history. Those staples and added entries were clumsy but trustworthy acts of record. By the end of 2019 we had, in private and sometimes awkward public ways, reconfigured the lines of recognition. Then the pandemic arrived, and chronology acquired a different urgency. In March 2020 the country tightened around distance and death. Our family, like every other, was forced to translate our fragile, newly widened table into a network of plastic calls and doorstep deliveries. The lesson we had learned about knowledge, that it offers choices, reasserted itself against the blunt calculus of contagion and care. Marcus's youngest contracted a fever in April. James delivered cough medicine and a text that read, simply, tell me what to do. My mother, who had grown into a quiet steadiness since the petition, learned to accept packages from Marco's wife when she could no longer manage the grocery runs. We traded not just gestures but logistical trust: who could visit the doctor, who could pick up prescriptions, who could feed the cat when someone needed to isolate. The DNA that had once felt like a wedge now served as a map for care. Publicly, the town's appetite for the story shifted as the pandemic throttled other forms of gossip. People had less energy for moral exegesis when their own parents were ill. The cousin who had loved the petition found fewer listeners. By late 2020, the online comment threads had thinned. The story that had been a weekly spectacle in the paper became a footnote in neighborhood talk. In private, resentments remained. We argued about who had been slow to call, about how to read the past. But by the time restrictions eased in 2021, the house felt less like a courtroom and more like a place where a dozen small, inconvenient acts constituted loyalty. Autumn 2021 brought another funeral, an old neighbor, where my mother moved through a crowd remembering earlier versions of our family. Her answer, "We handled it the only way we could," became a kind of family motto, not a triumph but a way of admitting the limits of our agency. The mantle photograph had become an artifact of that admission. Children who had been toddlers in the first picture were now in school uniforms and eager to recite the latest math problems. Their questions about fairness mutated into arithmetic. If there are 6 cookies and 7 people, who gets what? We tried to teach them that belonging was not a matter of splitting things but of deciding, again and again, who we would feed and who we would defend. In 2022, we began to see visible archival consequences of our choice to know. A local historian, alerted by the insertion of Marco's name into the Bible, asked to examine our family records for a town history project. We allowed her to copy the entry but insisted she not publish private letters. She unearthed a small packet of postmarked letters from the mid-1970s that had lain in the desk drawer of my father's study, a brittle cache that implied moments of account and absence, not malice. The letters did not absolve him, they merely asserted the human scale of remorse and small, occasional attempts at contact before he faded into silence. They complicated his portrait in ways that were instructive and painful, more human, less heroic. In August 2022, the historian presented a modest talk at the county library about how small families are keys to a town's broader narrative. She included our example as a cautionary footnote about silence and legacy. We attended reluctantly, and afterwards a neighbor said, "It was good to hear the context," and left it at that. Context, as the historian suggested, does not equate to exculpation, but it allows a town to move on. Across these years, the family Bible accrued more than names. In March 2023, James, who had been the most brittle of us, surprised the household by placing a carefully wrapped envelope into my mother's hands on her birthday. Inside was a set of property maps with a faint note: "If these can be of use, consider them yours to decide." It was not an admission about the estate, it was a private, sibling-level attempt to undo small harms, someone offering what he could. A week later, he and Marco organized a charity tool drive for the school's maintenance crew, a mundane act that required coordination and trust. These were not transformative gestures, but they were consistent ones. They extended the experiment in belonging outward. Not everyone softened. The cousin who had drafted the petition continued to post occasional sharp remarks, but with decreasing reach. Social media algorithms, hungry for spectacle, briefly amplified another version of the story in early 2024 when a blogger attempted to reframe our choices as hypocrisy. The post gained traction for a couple of days. Then, as online outrage did in those years, it burned out. More interesting to us were the smaller acts of reconciliation that did not attract clicks. A neighbor bringing over muffins, an old classmate writing a letter of apology for having listened to gossip too intently in the immediate aftermath. These quiet restorations mattered more than the digital storms. By 2024, the mantle photograph had migrated through several rooms. It spent part of the year propped against a stack of invoices, evidence of everyday life, and part of the year on the kitchen shelf where it watched breakfasts. Marco's children had grown into reluctant teenagers who sometimes sneered and sometimes spoke with an earnestness that felt like repair. They learned household skills from our family and taught us a few modern ones: how to scan family books, how to annotate old entries with dates and locations, how to digitize the handwriting that was fading. The family Bible, once sacrosanct and nearly fetishized, became a hybrid archive, equal parts faith object and genealogical ledger. Legal matters, while simmering less loudly, did not disappear. Some relatives continued to argue about what was owed, if anything, 3 years after the initial settlement. But the fight that had threatened a courtroom spectacle never reopened. There were, however, administrative ripples. In late 2024, a title company requested documentation of the amended headstone inscription in order to clear a minor property transfer. We produced a photocopy of the cemetery's record and a scanned page from the family Bible. The clerk, who had clerked in that office for 32 years, paused and said, "You all did the hard thing." That sentence, uttered by a practical civil servant, felt like the tacit recognition we had been seeking, that sometimes the ethical labor of a family is bureaucratic as much as theological. The years continued to rearrange private priorities. In April 2025, Marco's eldest, who had been 7 at the time of our first picture, graduated from 8th grade. James, who once would have avoided such functions, sat at the front and applauded like any uncle. After the ceremony, they took a photograph in the schoolyard and uploaded it to a private family group chat. The caption read, simply, "Onward." That small verb felt significant because it carried with it a history of stubborn persistence. The years of awkwardness, the letter in James's Bible, the headstone inscription, the sleepless nights of argument and the dull, less romantic kindnesses that had got them this far. We did not mistake this for full restoration. In late 2025, when our father's birth county historical society announced a centennial exhibition that included a small panel on prominent local families, the curator wrote asking whether our family would allow a reproduction of the mantle photograph. The request reopened sensitive debates about privacy and representation. A few relatives argued that public display would resuscitate old humiliations. Others said we owed the town an honest portrait. We decided to decline. Not all texts of family life belong in vitrines. Instead, we offered a brief statement for the exhibition's catalogue acknowledging that families are complicated and that our public submission might not be representative. The curator, disappointed but respectful, accepted. In private, the older people among us began to discuss legacy with practical urgency. My mother, who had aged into a quieter authority, began to ask about wills and caregiving arrangements with a thin, efficient voice. "Not everything is about what was wrong," she said in February 2026, "but we should decide how we'll be treated next." In March of that year, James asked a lawyer to draft a small amendment to his own will, not to distribute his late father's holdings differently but to ensure that, if he were able, he would leave a modest annuity to one of Marco's children to fund a vocational program. It was not a grand gesture, it did not undo decades of absence. It did, however, translate an emotional reconfiguration into institutional practice. James, who had once equated acceptance with dilution, had come to see recognition as a moral and practical responsibility. Throughout these episodes, genealogical knowledge did what knowledge often does: it proliferated consequences. After the initial reunion and the 3-week arrival of Marco into our lives, points of contact multiplied, not all of them welcome. New DNA matches continued to ping on family group websites, revealing cousins once unknown and the occasional branching that complicates tidy family narratives. In 2023, a woman from 3 counties away, someone who claimed she had been searching for family for a decade, emailed to say she had a partial match to the family tree. We corresponded, met for coffee twice, and added an asterisk to the Bible's margin. Each new match forced us to negotiate the logistics of belonging: who to invite to holidays, whose grief did we manage, how to categorize relationships that were legally non-existent but emotionally real. Our approach by then had become pragmatic rather than doctrinal. We extended invitations, kept separate beds for overnight guests, and refused to let a stranger's discovery become a weapon. The experiment continues. There are mornings when the photograph on the mantel seems like a small victory and evenings when old resentments flicker with familiar intensity. We still argue about what fairness means, especially when someone dies or a medical bill arrives. We still whisper about choices we would have made differently. But increasingly, the questions we ask one another are pragmatic. Who goes to the doctor? Who will fix the roof? Who will read aloud legal documents? The moral calculus of the family has, in many ways, become municipal and domestic rather than rhetorical. We measure loyalty by the timeliness of phone calls and the steadiness of spackling, by whether someone will sit with you while you sign forms and whether someone will save a seat at a play. I keep the photograph in a place where its gaze can catch me unawares. When I look at it now, I see lines I did not see before, shoulders that remember work, hands that have given grudging aid, faces that sometimes betray impatience and sometimes tenderness. The mantle photograph is not evidence of repair so much as evidence of ongoing negotiation. Knowledge, brought into the light by a DNA kit, by a 3-week revelation, by a creased apology tucked into a Bible, reordered us. It did not make things perfect, nor did it make them merely tolerable. It made them real. We continue to learn how to live with the obligations and the possibilities that reality imposes, and the experiment of widening our table goes on. After March 2026, the work of ordinary life continued to press against the moral experiments we had made. Small, administrative tasks took on the weight of moral decisions. In May 2026 we met again at the lawyer's office. My mother, James, Marco and I, because drafts must be witnessed and trust instruments must be ceded if they are to be anything more than intentions. The amendment James had asked for in March was now a formal document, a modest annuity designation, a named trustee, a clause specifying vocational training or apprenticeship rather than unrestricted cash. James insisted on the clause because he wanted the money to buy tools and instruction rather than to be frittered away. He wanted something durable. He signed with a hand that trembled not from age but from nerves, and later that summer he arranged for a small life insurance rider to underwrite the amount. It was neither heroic nor ostentatious. It was the kind of juridical kindness that takes time and paperwork rather than speeches. We were guarded about the transaction when we told other relatives. The cousin who had launched the petition in the first ugly winter continued, predictably, to bristle. He questioned the wisdom of institutionalizing assistance for Marco's children. The dispute never re-escalated into litigation. There was no courthouse drama, but it did simmer in family WhatsApp threads and over coffee with neighbors. In July 2026, the cousin wrote a long note criticizing our willingness to normalize what he still called a breach. James replied once, with restraint, and then we let the exchange cool. Social media threw up another brief wave of commentary in August when a regional podcast ran a segment on DNA families, and used our story as a case study. The segment was humane in parts and sensational in others. For 2 weeks we received polite notes from listeners and, unusually, calls from 2 local ministers asking whether communal forgiveness required public spectacle. We declined sermonizing invites. Our family had learned to distrust platforms that demanded either villainy or sainthood. The family Bible continued to accrue marginalia. In September 2026 we resolved to do something we had spoken about for a while: digitize the book and create a controlled archive. With the help of Marco's eldest, now a teenager who, against odds, liked scanning and metadata, we produced a full, searchable version of the Bible and the related pages we had collected: marriage certificates, baptismal slips, the copied cemetery record, and the small cache of letters the historian had found in 2022. We drew up a modest access agreement with the County Historical Society. The scans would be stored on the Society servers, with the letters placed under restricted access for 30 years, and with a searchable index available to genealogists and local scholars. In October, the Society accepted the deposit on those terms. The historian who had first approached us in August 2022 gave a short public lecture about moral archives and consent. She read a passage from one of the letters aloud, not to sensationalize but to demonstrate how absence could be legible. That October talk drew a polite crowd and, more meaningfully, convinced a few neighbors that archives could be repositories of complexity rather than trophies of confession. As the Bible's digital twin moved into the county archive, other branches of our family tree kept sprouting. DNA matches continued to ping on the sites we had used in 2022. In November 2026, a woman from the Appalachian Valley, someone who had been searching intermittently since the 1990s, emailed to say she had a second-degree match to our family and the same surname in her grandfather's notes. We corresponded cautiously for months. In January 2027, we met her at a diner halfway between our towns and added her to the annotated margin of the Bible as M2. She brought with her an oral history tape. Her mother had preserved stories about a man who had passed through their family in the 1960s, and the tape's rhythms, hesitations, laughter, the cadence of names, helped us imagine networks we had not known. We did not invite her immediately into holidays. Invitations now required conversations about expectations and boundaries. We asked new connections whether they wanted to be in group chats, whether they wanted contact at funerals, whether they wanted shared funds or simply information. These were not decisions easily reduced to piety or anger, they were logistical and ethical measures that had to be calibrated one person at a time. The presence of Marco in our household life continued to change predictable things. In February 2027, he accepted a steady contract with the County Public Works Department, an arrangement brokered informally with an acquaintance who had heard about the tool drive of 2023 and remembered the competence Marco had shown. The contract was seasonal at first, mowing, winterizing, painting, but it provided a predictable income and a measure of standing. It also made it easier for his children to stay in school without the pressure of extra jobs. Marco, who had once been the figure of estrangement, became a familiar presence at PTA meetings and at the local feed store. He remained awkward in public handshakes and sometimes late to text confirmations, but he was there. The children's trajectories mattered to us in ways that felt unsubtle. Marco's eldest, the one who had been 7 at the first picture and who graduated 8th grade in April 2025, entered high school in the fall of 2027. The younger siblings, who by now had learned to move between our house and theirs with a tentative ease, began to take vocational classes. The annuity James had signed in 2026 was not yet invoked, but in late 2027 we used a small discretionary fund. Money from a family savings account that had once been earmarked for an uncle's graduation party, to pay for an introductory welding course for Marco's middle child. The course lasted 8 weeks and culminated, improbably, in a certificate and a small demonstration of welded planters rolled out on the high school campus. At the certificate presentation, James stood in the back blinking, and afterward he handed Marco a thermos and said, simply, "Good work." It was not an absolution. It was, again, an ordinary human act with which we measured moral distance by the frequency of small, practical kindnesses. Not all of the community watched us benignly. In March 2028, a local newspaper ran an editorial about genealogical tourism in small towns. People who used DNA tools to claim rural identities, the paper argued, often without the accountability that comes from lived relation. The editorial referenced our family as a cautionary tale. It noted that we had declined to place the mantle photograph in the centennial exhibit and that we had deposited the Bible under restricted access. The piece struck a chord. A councilman from a neighboring village called my mother to ask whether the town could host a forum on ethics and kinship. We declined, politely but firmly. Having our story turned into a civic teachable moment felt like reliving grief under the guise of education. We agreed, however, to provide anonymized data about our process, the legal steps, the archiving terms, the family agreement, to a working group the council convened. In May 2028, a short pamphlet titled Kinship and Consent in the Genomic Era cited our family's documentation as a practical example of boundary setting. The domestic negotiations continued alongside these public ripples. In June 2028, my mother's health required more attentive caregiving. She was still clear-headed but less energetic, and in July the family instituted a schedule. Mornings were for paperwork and medication management. Afternoons rotated among those who could take time off work for errands. Evenings were for reading aloud and small, domestic arguments. James, who had once avoided responsibility like one avoids a sting, found himself coordinating the schedule because he lived closest. He did it without flourishes, and his competence at domestic administration became an unexpected through line in our family's reconstitution. It was, remarkably, the quality that steadied us more than the rhetorical gestures of reconciliation had ever done. Because of the caregiving schedule we began, almost by accident, to write down procedures. We made a binder, prosaic, utilitarian, that listed doctors' numbers, the location of the safe deposit key, bank accounts, and the password to the Apple account. We included a statement about privacy regarding the family Bible and a recommended protocol for approaching new DNA matches. Meet in a public place, bring a third party if desired, and agree on what is or is not to be recorded. The binder would later be photocopied and placed in 3 houses. In October 2028, Marco asked to keep a copy in his garage because he wanted to know where to find the deed to the tool chest that had belonged to our grandfather. He taped a post-it to the front that read, "For now, handles and memories." The binder became, in a small and domestic sense, our constitutional text, less doctrinal than practical. The sharpest test came in November 2028, when an elderly aunt I had always thought of as countenance rather than closeness died after a short illness. Her will left no surprising bequests, but the funeral reopened old arguments about who was entitled to speak at memorials and who had the right to the eulogies. The cousin who had drafted the petition wanted a formal statement that emphasized lineage. Others wanted candor about mistakes. We chose a compromise, a single, brief program that permitted any relative to speak for 5 minutes and asked speakers to avoid recrimination. The funeral itself was small, held at the town church, and the parishioners who attended remembered the aunt for her punctuality and her bread pudding. Afterward, there were the usual conversations in kitchens: who would take the crock-pot, where the silver would go, but also a few tender moments. Marco, standing by the casket, quietly explained to James that he had always known a different version of the aunt, one who had once given him $1 in a grocery store when he was a boy and ashamed to ask. James listened and shook his head. "I had never heard that," he said. The phrase was not a cure, it was the admission of a new piece of evidence. Into 2029, the genealogical notices continued, but with diminishing panic. People reached out from farther away: a man in the Midwest with a distant Y chromosome match, a woman in the city with a letter from her grandmother that mentioned our family in passing, and we responded with the same cautious generosity. We formed, in early 2029, a small family council composed of 4 people across the branches: my mother as elder, James as executor of practicalities, Marco as representative of the newer line, and the cousin who had once been most enraged, who now attended with a kind of chafing toleration. We met quarterly in the town library conference room to discuss the binder, any emergent legal needs, and the rules for outreach to new matches. The council was less about authority than about shared protocols. In that way, it reflected the transition of the family from a set of claims and resentments to an ongoing municipal project. The council also allowed us to make decisions that in earlier years would have flared into moral theater. In April 2029, the high school initiated a trade fair day and invited contributions. The family donated 2 toolboxes and a small scholarship for a summer carpentry camp. The scholarship bore no name scandalized by the past. It was simply listed as the Family Trade Award. We decided on that anonymity after a long and somewhat heated conversation, because names in such contexts can reopen old wounds or create parochial rivalries. The award was small, enough for 1 summer course, but the kid who won it, the daughter of a teacher, cried when she received the stipend because she could not otherwise afford the tuition. That afternoon Marco took a photo, 2 toolbox lids with a small ribbon, and later he texted it to the family group with nothing written but a single emoji: a wrench. There were still nights when old resentments woke us. I would wake at 2 a.m. and rehearse things I could not now change, arguments I had not had, apologies I had not extracted, the sense of a life rendered naughty by a single omission. But the longer duration of the experiment, the steady, often boring work of wills and binders, of small scholarships and scheduled caregiving, changed us in ways that rhetoric alone would not have. Knowledge, once poured into the family from a swab packet and a 3-week revelation, had dispersed into practices, legal instruments, archived scans, and repeated domestic courtesies. Those practices were not the end of the story, they were instead the medium through which the story would proceed. We knew from the patterns of our town's history and from the records in the county archive that stories like ours rarely resolve neatly. Families accrete contradictions like barnacles. Sometimes those contradictions calcify into feuds, sometimes they are worn smooth by daily use. We did not presume to predict whether our negotiations would harden into a new normal or gradually revert to old divisions. We did, however, find that after the first shock of discovery, after the 3-week arrival of Marco, after the insertion of his name into the Bible, after the letters were read, what mattered most was not the original revelation but the repeated decisions that followed it: how we set up the annuity in March 2026, how we digitized the Bible in September 2026, how we established the binder in June 2028, how we convened a council in early 2029. Those were the dates and actions that would, in years to come, be taken out as evidence of intention or neglect. So the mantle photograph still sits where it catches me unawares. It watches as we keep making lists and go to the doctor and mow the lawn, as we argue about which relative will host Thanksgiving and whom to invite to graduations. The experiment of widening our table has become, in practical terms, a set of standing orders that persist through months and summers and small tragedies. We do not expect perfection. We do expect that the next argument will involve more than rhetoric. It will require a phone call, a letter, a lawyer, a meal, or the application form for a vocational course. We have learned to measure obligation not merely by sentiment but by the steadiness of action. Long after the initial DNA test and the 3-week revelation that brought Marco to our door, we are still learning how to codify decency, to convert moral surprise into institutional habit, and to keep a place at the table for those who were late to arrive. By midsummer 2029, the calendar of our improvised institutions had begun to cast a predictable shadow. The council met on the first Tuesday of March, June, September, and December. The binder got revised in June to include emergency contacts for Marco's children, and the scholarship application deadline slid into late May so that students could apply before summer registration. Those small administrative rhythms mattered because they produced a ledger of accountability. They also provided a quiet proof against the temptation to reduce our family story to a single sensational origin: 3 weeks, a swab, a knock on a door, and then forget the slow arithmetic of care. In July 2029, the town newspaper ran a follow-up piece on the pamphlet Kinship and Consent in the Genomic Era. The reporter had interviewed one of the council members who had used our anonymized material to draft the county's suggested best practices for historical societies and small museums. The article noted that the library, where we had met, now required a deposit form for any family archive that contained genetic information. The form asked depositors to specify access restrictions and to identify a trustee who could consent to queries on behalf of living descendants. We were listed in the article as the family that had inspired the policy, not as heroes or villains but as an example of the messy realities that accompanied new technologies. The piece prompted a modest uptick in calls from neighboring towns asking how to replicate our binder, and once again we felt the awkwardness of being a case study. That autumn, the graduate student from the state university, whose advisor had read the May 2028 pamphlet, wrote to request access to our anonymized files for a thesis on rural kinship and archives. The council debated the request at the September meeting. My mother, whose energy had been diminishing slowly since June 2028, listened and then said plainly, "If we can protect people's stories, and they can't be exploited, then yes." We granted access with conditions. The files were to be redacted, the thesis could not include photographs that might identify living relatives, and the university would sign a non-disclosure clause for data that had been provided by matches we had contacted directly. The student came in October, sat at the table in the library conference room, and methodically photographed our binder's table of contents and the notation pages where we had written "meet in public, bring third party, and request no recording unless agreed." Months later, when she defended her dissertation, she cited our family as one of 3 field sites where privacy agreements materially shaped relational outcomes. The council received a bound copy. Our member who had once been most enraged leafed through it and then said nothing. His silence was not forgiveness but a new mode of oversight. Winter 2029 brought the annual holiday at my mother's house. We had developed a ritual by then: one afternoon of cooking, a scheduled rotation of hosts for the gathering, and an empty chair reserved at the table for any relative who might arrive unannounced but would be welcomed. James, who coordinated the schedule, arrived early to take down the decorations and to make sure the thermometer in the parlor was set so my mother would not overheat. Marco's middle child, who had kept the welding certificate like a talisman, brought a small planter he had welded, painted a dull blue, and sat it on the mantel with an air of shyness. Someone photographed the planter next to the old family Bible. The photograph was later printed and placed under restricted view in the archive entry for the Bible, with the caption noting who had made the planter and how we had chosen to manage public access. The year 2030 opened with a procedural ripple that had consequences. In March 2030, the County Commission held a public hearing on a proposed ordinance that would create a registry for family archives that contained biometric-derived information. The ordinance proposed a framework for consent, data retention, and archival restriction periods. Our pamphlet and the university dissertation were both submitted as written testimony. James testified on behalf of the council. He read, in a voice the room recognized, the binder's guideline that asked future matches to meet in public and to bring a third party. He did not speak about the early weeks, the rawness of James the son who once avoided responsibility. Instead he spoke about the mundane efficacy of checklists and schedules. The ordinance passed with a sunset clause, meaning it would be revisited in 4 years, and the Commission publicly thanked those who had contributed examples. Passing a statute is not the same as changing hearts, but it does change the terms in which families can make choices. My mother's health was the slow subplot of these institutional developments. She remained lucid into 2030, and in May she surprised us by attending the high school's summer orientation, where the recipient of our small carpentry scholarship spoke with confidence about his plans. He had been the kid whose mother taught at the school and who had cried on stage. Seeing him steady and determined made my mother cry, and those were the kindest tears she shed in front of us in years. The council used the moment to formalize the scholarship's awarding process. An adjudication panel, written criteria, and a small endowment fund managed by a trustee to ensure the award would continue beyond the immediate family's active involvement. We named the trustee after a family vote in June 2030. It was not a name from the Bible or the mantle photograph, but the librarian who had helped us navigate the archive's accession procedures. In August 2030, a distant match from the Midwest sent scans of a letter penned in 1949 mentioning a boy who had left town and kept in touch rarely. The letter corroborated details we had long suspected about migration patterns in our family. The council arranged a mediated call between the Midwest match and Marco. There was an awkward moment early in the conversation. Years of omission can make small talk brittle, but by the third call, the Midwest match and Marco had arranged to swap genealogical notes and to send each other photos of family groupings from the 1950s. Those photos were later digitized, redacted of certain identifying marginalia, and added to the database accessible to family members with a clearance code. Again, the pattern returned, revelation followed by administrative labor, which in turn eased the practicalities of relation. Perhaps the most challenging decisions involved property and legal status. In October 2030, the question of grandfather's tool chest returned because Marco wanted to restore it. The chest had been mentioned in the binder as an estate item, but its deed had never been updated after a messy succession in the 1990s. We sought counsel. A small meeting with an estate lawyer in November clarified options. A simple transfer with signed acknowledgement from the executor. A putative co-ownership agreement that would allow Marco to keep the chest while making it available for public display at trade fair events, or the path chosen. A custodial agreement that allowed Marco to retain physical possession while the family council retained certain rights to curate the chest's provenance. The agreement was signed on December 3, 2030, and the tool chest was repaired over the winter in Marco's garage, the same place where he had taped a post-it in October 2028 reading "For now, handles and memories." If any year could be said to have resolved anything, it was 2031 in only a modest sense. The procedural systems we had created were tested but remained intact. Early that spring my mother's condition deteriorated. In late April she moved into a hospice unit connected to the community hospital where we had all taken turns sitting with her. The binder's existence mattered. It allowed James to access the medical proxy forms without argument, it provided the hospice with a contact list, and it instructed us to honor my mother's stipulation that the family Bible be placed under restricted access for 1 year after death before certain documents could be made public. She died on May 14, 2031, surrounded by the scheduled visitors who arrived at the appointed times. She was 78. We followed the protocol we had written 2 summers earlier, a brief program, 5-minute slots for speakers, and an agreement to avoid recrimination. There was, of course, recrimination in private. Loss does not obliterate the past. But the procedures we had installed allowed the public rituals to be less volatile than they might otherwise have been. In the months after her death, the family began a new phase of archival work. The Bible, having been digitized in September 2026 and stored under restricted access, was now placed on deposit in the county archive with a 1-year embargo as my mother had wished. Curators agreed to preserve the physical book in controlled conditions and to allow researchers access under the same redaction rules we had applied to the graduate student. The mantle photograph, as before, stayed in the house in a place where it catches me unawares, as I had written once, because its public exhibition would have felt like a stunt. The council drafted a small explanatory note for the archive file describing why certain items were restricted, a genealogy of decisions as much as of kinship. The years between 2032 and 2034 were quieter in some ways and busier in others. Marco's children finished school. The eldest entered an apprenticeship program related to welding and metalwork, partly financed by family contributions and partly by external grants he sought.